Before we can move on to our next big topic, we need to quickly learn about something called truthy and falsy values. So in JavaScript, a falsy value is a value that is considered false when evaluated in an if-else statement condition. And the values that are falsy in JavaScript are undefined, null, zero, empty strings, and not a number values. So let me actually write that down for you, okay? So falsy values, they are undefined, null, zero, empty strings, and not a number. So we didn't talk about this here yet, but you will see examples of this here later in the course, okay? So all of these 5 different values here will be converted to false when evaluated in a true-false condition, okay? And so that's why we call them falsy. They are not exactly false, but they will turn out to be false when evaluated in a if-else condition. Now we also have truthy values. And of course, the truthy values are all the values that are considered true when evaluated in an if-else statement condition. And so basically, it's all the values that are not falsy. Okay, so let's now take a look at an example to demonstrate how this works. Okay, so let's define a variable of height, let's say, and we will not actually define it, so we just declare it here. And now let's write an if-else statement. So we can say if height, and then log to the console the variable is defined, and else the variable has not been defined. So let's see what happens here. And what we get printed is that the variable has not been defined. And so why is that happening? Well, we declared the variable here as height, but we didn't define it. And so you already know that it's now undefined. And we also know that undefined is a falsy value, right? And so in here, when we say if height, then this height here is converted to false. And so therefore we enter the else block, which will then print that the variable hasn't been defined yet. And so this is a very handy way of testing if a variable has actually been defined or not. Okay, and now let's say that we actually do define a value. So let's say 23. And so watch what happens now. And so of course the variable is now defined, okay? And so that's because everything that is not a falsy value is a truthy value. And so we already know that when a variable exists, well, then this here will be converted to true, and therefore the if block here is entered. Okay, so again, a very handy way of testing if a variable actually exists. Now there's just one thing to keep in mind here, and that is that notice how this 0 also is a falsy value. But the height can of course be 0. So let's set it to 0 here, and so the variable is actually defined now, isn't it? So we have a value here, it's not undefined. But if we now reload this, well, then it still says that the variable has not been defined. And so that's of course a situation that we want to avoid. So this here can not only be height, but we also have to say that if the variable is 0, well then the variable is also defined. Okay, and remember that we can use the OR operator to do exactly that. So we already used the AND operator before, but we also talked about the OR operator. And so we can say OR, the height is equal to 0. Okay, and so that will fix the problem. And this is quite a common pattern in JavaScript to check if a variable is defined. So we check if the variable exists or if it is equal to 0. And then the if block here is in fact entered. Okay, so let's check that out again. And so now we see that the variable is defined. Okay, and remember that only one of these here has to be true in order for the entire condition to be true. Okay, so in this case now, the height is 0, and so this here will be converted to false. Okay, but we then have height equal to 0, which is true, of course, because in this situation the height is 0. And so we have false and true, which will result in true. And so therefore this line of code here is then executed. All right, and now this is going to work with any number here and also with strings. So let's say 20, for example. And you see that it's still true because it still entered that first block. But if we have an empty string, remember that also is a falsy value as we see here. So with an empty string, it now says the variable has not been defined again. And so that kind of makes sense, right? Because in fact, there's not really something there. It's just like an empty string, okay? So these are falsy and truthy values and a handy way to check if a variable is actually defined. Now, just to finish, let's talk about the two different equality operators. So we've always used this triple equal operator, right? And this is the one for strict equality comparisons. But there's also the equal equal. So this operator here, and the difference is that this one does type coercion, which means that the data types of both variables do not have to match, okay? So let me show that to you actually in practice. So just a comment here, and now let's say if height equals 23, so we have a string now here, then let's simply log to the console the equal equal operator does type coercion, okay? And so let's check out what happens. And before we do that, let's set this here back to 23, okay? So what we're doing here is to compare the height, which is 23, a number, with the string of 23 with the non-strict equality operator, which is this one. So only two equals. So let's take a look at this. And so you see that this actually turns out to be true. And so we enter this first if block. And so you see the equal equal operator does type coercion. So what this means is that JavaScript, when we use this operator here, converts the string of 23 to a number and then says that it's the same as 23, the number. So let's take a look at that here again. So 23 and then the string 23, and it will say that it is true. Okay, so exactly what we observed in here. So again, JavaScript does type coercion, which basically means to convert the string here to a number and then compares the numbers, and then of course they are the same, right? Now, if instead we use the strict equality operator with the three equal signs, well, then it will not do type coercion, and so therefore, what do you think will happen now? Yes, indeed, it now says that it's false, because in fact, they are two different things. So we have 23 the number and 23 the string, and they are different things, and so in fact, we want them not to be the same, okay? And so if instead we had the three equals here, well, then of course, we will not see this output here. We will not see this log to the console because it's false, okay? So that is how the strict equality operator works, and it is absolutely a best practice to always use the triple equal, so the strict equality operator, in order to avoid unexpected situations and bugs. So that's why I've been using this operator all the time with the three equals and not just the two equals.